Well, greetings, everyone. Welcome to this interactive training about Constitution Day. Very happy that you have sacrificed some of your, or invested some of your time to be with us this evening. Welcome. Alfonso, do you want to say anything before we get started, or will that be a bit later?
Sure. Yeah. I just wanted to welcome everyone and invite folks to unmute themselves. Well, keep yourself muted during the discussion, the presentation that we're going to be doing. But afterwards, there's going to be a space for everyone to share your thoughts and opinions about how this presentation relates to you. And I'm also going to be dropping that in the chat. But thank you so much for that reminder, Greg. Go ahead.
Yes, I was muted. I'm Greg Coleridge, one of the co-directors at Move to Amend. And again, welcome to this constitutional interactive training. Okay, switch. Next slide. The agenda for this evening is a very quick overview of Move to Amend for those of you who may not be totally familiar with our outfit. We're going to do a Constitutional Day and Timeline exercise overview of what this whole program is about, and then do some deep diving into a participatory exercise walkthrough. It's going to be sort of a combined sort of training, learning, but as well participation on your part. So get ready to take part. And then that'll be followed by some questions and answers from you, and then announcement of resources, takeaways, for those of you who wish to replicate this process where you are. So that's what we're going to be doing this evening. Next slide. All right, again, just a little background to Move to Amend. Our mission, as it has been from day one, we are a coalition of hundreds of organizations, of more than 700 actually, and nearly 500,000 individuals committed to social and economic justice, ending corporate rule, and building a vibrant democracy that is genuinely, credibly, authentically accountable to the people and not corporate interests or plutocrats for that matter. Next. Whoops, just go back. Okay, our principles and goals. We have always had these two goals. Many believe that Move to Amend is only been focused on this first, which is extremely important to pass the We the People Amendment, which in this session of Congress is H.R. 54, to make crystal clear that artificial entities do not have constitutional rights and that money is not speech. A corporation is not a person, and money is not First Amendment protected free speech. But this other goal is just as important, to provoke discussion and organizing about how to make real the promise of democracy that goes beyond the We the People Amendment through constitutional renewal that is wider and deeper than simply as ambitious as the Move to Amend We the People Amendment is. Nevertheless, that's merely a stepping stone. There's a lot more that needs to be done to create an authentic, real democracy for the very first time. Next slide. Just go back. Principles and values. Again, these have been our sort of basic ground, foundational principles and values from the moment we came into existence in 2010. We focused on anti-oppression and solidarity organizing, believe that people who have been historically oppressed from day one in this country, we the people have never, ever been all the people, need to be their voices lifted up and their skills and abilities authentically included and seated around the table when plans are being formulated, decisions being made. We're focused on coalition movement building. We can't do it alone. We don't have enough power. We need allies, and we need to build a democracy movement. Democracy is what we are calling for. It's an end, but it's also a means. Ends and means go inextricably together. Grassroots organizing. We just can't be at a national nation state level or national, working with national ally organizations, we need and are focused on grassroots organizing through our affiliates and advocates in trying to help organize people where they are, focusing on issues where they are, and making those inextricable connections to ending corporate rule and big money in elections. Dedicated to political education. Look, we got to get on the other side of the learning curve on how we got into this mess. We don't learn this in school. I never did. Didn't learn it in many activist circles. Certainly not in the media, in any other formal institutions in our society. And it's absolutely important, essential, that we remain both, and again, inextricably connected, to be politically and economically interdependent and independent, apart from well-to-do individuals, corporations, big foundations, political parties, and any other major institution that can pull strings or push levers that can marginalize or temper what we feel we need to do in authentically representing the people at the grassroots who we're trying to represent and support. Next slide. Our structure is we have a national board, a leadership team, a number of national staff, many of whom are on this call this evening. We have local affiliates. These are groups across the country who do the work sort of at that grassroots level that we mentioned in the previous slide. We have local advocates. These are individual people, not part of an existing group yet, but individuals who go out, go forth, who may be part of other organizations, who bring Move to Amend's material, information, analysis, but also by being in those organizations can bring back to us the kind of work, the kind of activities, the sort of strategies, tactics, and mission that those organizations and those groups are doing that we can learn from and support. And then we have coalition partners at the local level, state level, national level that are working on issues that intersect in one way, shape, or form that metaphorically can't get, quite honestly, past first base without an end to corporate constitutional rights and money being defined as free speech. All right, so what is this thing, Constitution Day? Maybe you've heard about it, right? It is on the calendar, the 17th of September. It's when the guys, and they were all guys in Philadelphia, that signed the Constitution, the second one actually, first one being Articles of Confederation. And so to acknowledge that each and every year, there are celebrations and commemorations galore at all sorts of levels, but also in educational institutions. And in fact, each year, educational institutions receive federal funding that mandate programming on the US Constitution around that day. So, hey, why not try to take advantage of it? And that's what this program is in part designed to do. This program, and this provides Move to Amend an opportunity, a good opportunity to make the connections with those in educational settings, educators, administrators, and students themselves, and talk about the process that needs to happen to amend the Constitution. How easy, how difficult, what needs to be amended, and so forth, as a way to make real change that is more than just marginal and tangential. We encourage Move to Amend supporters everywhere and affiliates to reach out to their educational institutions. It doesn't only have to be high schools, it can be middle schools, it can be colleges, universities, but it also can be in the community, apart from formal academic educational, it can be community education. So take it to your community, and we provide materials that can be certainly presented in the correct classroom, but also in the community. Next slide. All right, there are ways to use this opportunity, again, trying to take full advantage of the fact that this day is being commemorated and acknowledged and used to, in many cases, only touch on what, if not ignore, what the Constitution is, what it isn't, how it created rights for some, but not for others. So we need to take advantage of that. So the ways to use this opportunity is, one, to offer to give a presentation in a classroom and talk about corporate constitutional rights by using some of the materials that are going to be shown this evening. Offer our earlier video, 27 minutes, I think it is, so it's perfect for a classroom, called Legalized Democracy. And we'll make sure to put the link to that in the chat, but is also on the page announcing and presenting information of Constitution Day. It's called Legalized Democracy, so that can be offered to teachers to show in class and offered to lead a discussion. And there's some questions that even has been put together, so you don't even have to generate those. You can just use those sort of provocative questions connected to that video. But the third thing is to use the interactive, what we're going to look at very soon, rights and privileges timeline exercise presentation, which again, we're going to be going through momentarily in your community to encourage people to think about rights and social change in this constitutional context. And there's two real resources of this rights and privileges timeline exercise that can be used individually or together. One is a wall poster, and the second are cards. And the next slide actually shows the wall poster. And maybe some of you have used that. If not, that is available. And again, there's a link to it on the Move to Amend Constitution Day page that will be shortly listed in the chat. So you can see it, and there's a timeline that goes from sort of the early days of the part of the formation of this country right up pretty much to the present, with three different tracks that we're going to get into that are reflected in this second way that this timeline is expressed through these cards. And the timelines, in fact, are people's history timeline, human rights or anti-oppression or oppression timeline, and corporate rights timeline. Okay, next. So it's a great visual, and it's something that oftentimes when people go into classrooms, they have the cards that we're going to talk about, but they also have a copy of that long poster, I don't know, 18 feet or 12 feet, something like that, that they hang on a wall and is very visible and is an educational tool all by itself. All right, the purposes of this exercise that we call Rights and Privileges Timeline is as follows: to examine the role of the U.S. Constitution in defining legal personhood, to understand how the legal definition of personhood, who is a person and who isn't, shapes our democracy, quote unquote democracy. Third, to examine the implications of corporations having the legal status of a person with constitutional rights, as bizarre as that is. And last, to make the connections, extremely important, between all of these things that are connected, some more closely than others: personhood, law, rights, and privileges. Next slide. So the materials that will be needed, and again, all these are available, and so you don't have to, write them down or take a screenshot or a picture with your iPhone or whatever, but all of these will be available, both this visual and this slide program and other materials. But to do this exercise in person, one needs obviously tape for posting to a wall. That if you're going to use the poster, if you're going to use the note cards, then sort of 8.5 by 11. Here's an example of one of these. You can see it. So just simply an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, and we have 3 timelines with sort of historical events that have taken place, again, from day one in this country, even prior to that, the Bill of Rights, up to the present time. So those can be downloaded. So there's a whole link of historical events for the corporate rights timeline, human rights timeline, and oppression timeline. And so, as you can see, one for corporate rights, one for human rights, one for oppression or white privilege. Each card will have the date and name of historical event or law on the front and description on the back. So all of that is if you're doing this in person. If you're doing this in virtual form, which is what we're doing tonight, then you need the slideshow presentation, which we'll have available very shortly. It's pretty much what you're going to see coming up, minus the prompts, the technical educational prompts, and plus the accompanying script that can be adapted for your use. All right, next slide. All right, and so with that, just to sort of lay out a very brief context for what it is this is trying to do and frame, it's extremely important, we believe. Move to Amend has 2 goals that have always been intertwined: to amend the Constitution, to abolish corporate personhood in money and speech, and to build a democracy movement across issues and oppressions that work together. to replace our current corporate and plutocratic system with a system that we hope promotes justice for all and would be legitimate for the very first time. The US Constitution, if you think about it, is the major arena to study and understand the connection between personhood, law, rights, and privileges. Whatever issues people may be working on, we want to collaborate with them to create a whole new system. We want to ask what new laws, cultures, founding documents, and alternatives that we need to go beyond the amendment. Yes, the amendment is important, but again, merely a stepping stone, and actually create a new world, a better world, a just, peaceful, nonviolent, and sustainable one. But it's easy to get too focused on our first goal alone, to amend the Constitution, to abolish corporate personhood and money of speech, as important as that is. We must address larger issues of justice and inclusion. And this raises, and that's what this exercise does, the following questions. Why do we need a democracy movement to both pass and build on our amendment? Why can't we just focus on the amendment and be done with it? Another question is, why do we need to build movements across race, class, and gender? Hey, that sounds nice, but what does it have to do with Move to Amend and this amendment? And lastly, why is the amendment alone not enough? Well, the answers, as this exercise tries to lift up, is that real democracy goes way beyond the We the People Amendment. Abolishing corporate constitutional rights and money is free speech doesn't touch many of the laws and rules that oppress individuals and groups that were not part of the original We the People and the Constitution, and in fact, in many cases, still aren't. It also ignores the cultural changes required to affirm dignity, respect, and justice. You know, this is an effort that's really two-pronged or two-tracked. One, trying to change the law, but the other is trying to change the culture. Social change has always included these twin efforts. So the exercise, as you're about to witness and participate in, involves sharing specific historical markers along these three separate, but in many ways, interrelated tracks: people's rights, corporate rights, and state oppression. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cole to get us going, where he will share some brief comments, and then Alfonso will instruct you how to participate in this exercise and beyond. Cole.
Hi, everybody. My name is Cole Bennett. I'm a National Fellow with Move to Amend. I just want to thank everybody for taking their time to spend the evening with us, talk about these issues, and hopefully take them and disseminate them through your communities. This is incredibly important work that is going to take all of us. Oftentimes doing this work, we are told, how difficult it is to amend the Constitution, and if anything, it has only gotten more difficult as time has gone on. But what's important to remember when we are going through the people's rights timeline and these victories that have been made for people's rights is to not only contrast them with the timelines that will be coming up about corporate rights and state oppression, but also to think about the people and the movements that came before this, sometimes, decades in the making, of people just like yourselves, just like us here at Move to Amend, that felt strongly enough to fight this good fight. And so we're just going to briefly go through the timeline, starting with the Bill of Rights in 1791, just a couple years after the Constitution. A group of revolutionaries rejected the Constitution as simply, a document made by white slave owners that did not account for fundamental rights guaranteed from oppression, similar to the situation that they had just left in Great Britain. They said they wouldn't ratify it until these basic protections were written into the Constitution or amended to the Constitution, and they were successful, obviously. Now we have the Bill of Rights that we all know very well, of the freedom of speech, the freedom to assemble, freedom of religion, press, right to privacy, right to a fair trial, you name it. They were obviously, this was the first amendments to the Constitution, and we can move on from here to the next one for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
Hey,
or the
Cole?
13th. Yes.
Yeah, I think maybe Alfonso, this is a good point, time for Alfonso to kick in, because this is when we want to try to get people to participate
Absolutely.
and do this.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, as Greg mentioned, please unmute yourself and share your thoughts on each of these points that we have mentioned thus far and how they connect to corporate power. You can engage using the stack process, either raising your virtual hand on Zoom or writing stack in the chat, and we will call on 2 or 3 folks this time. I'm looking at the chat. Also,
I think what we wanted, wasn't it, Alfonso? What we wanted to do was to encourage
the end.
people
Okay.
to read these cards and to volunteer to do that, or that you would just call on people, assuming individuals were willing to read.
All right. Do we have any volunteers that would like to read this? What's on screen right now? Awesome. Go ahead, Lawrence.
Yeah, thank you. So the 13th Amendment in 1865, slavery is abolished in the United States and any place subject to its jurisdiction.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Next one. I could read it as well. The 14th Amendment, 1868, Black males are now citizens. The law cannot discriminate against them in any way. We have another volunteer for the next one. Oh, that's a little. Okay. Yes, go ahead, Karen.
Social changes in 1886, the year that the Supreme Court first gave corporations human rights. This is what the rest of the country was up to. A campaign for the 8-hour day. The Knights of Labor membership was at 1 million, with 60,000 Black and even more women members. Farmers Alliance reaches 100,000 members. Populists draw up founding document to demand debtors' rights and fight the railroad lobby. Eugene Debs builds the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen. Das Kapital by Karl Marx was published in English, and police brutalize labor activists in the Haymarket Massacre.
Thank you very much, Karen. We do have a few more, but how many do we want to do? Sorry, my dog is not content right now. All right, we have the 15th Amendment in 1870, Black males get the right to vote. The 17th Amendment, 1913, the US Senate is now elected by the people instead of appointed by state governors. Do we have another ticket to do? Maybe one last one? Go ahead, Tim.
19th Amendment, 1920, women finally get the vote after 75 years of struggle. And the Grange helped with that.
Yes, they did.
All right, wonderful. Do you want to take it back, Cole? Do we want to
Yeah,
more people?
yeah, this next one is important. Do we have a volunteer for this one? If not, I can go, Alfonso.
All right. Do we have any takers?
I'll go. This is Margaret.
Go ahead, Margaret.
The Supreme Court recognized that separate was not equal and ruled that public schools cannot be racially segregated.
Yeah, excellent. And moving on to the 24th Amendment, another voting rights one. The 1964 abolished what we all know to be racist poll tax that were used to keep blacks and other groups of people from voting in some states. And then the next one is also a big one. This
Yeah.
one, if we have any volunteers, this one hits close to home for a lot of people.
Yeah. I can read it. The Civil Rights Act. Wonderful. Tim, you want to go again?
Oh, I'd love to. I mean, I'll take over if you let me. But wait a minute. Civil Rights Acts, 1960, established federal inspection of local voter registration rolls. I just moved to Virginia then. 1964 prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin by federal and state governments. 1968 prohibits discrimination in sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, creed, and national origin.
Yeah, it's a big one.
So next we have the 26th Amendment passed in 1971. The most recent victory in terms of amending the Constitution to grant rights to people. Around Vietnam, the voting age was changed from 21 to 18 years of age, passed to obviously recognize that if you were able to be drafted, you should be able to vote for who is drafting you. Again, this is one that, people are trying to roll back these days, but it's solidified in the Constitution, and it's not going anywhere because that's how these things work. And then the next one, on the other hand, some things do not always last, and I think this one, Roe v. Wade, obviously established the right to the constitutional right to an abortion based on a 9th and 14th Amendment rights to privacy. Obviously, this is an issue that has just recently been overturned by the Dobbs decision. And it's a good example of why we cannot rely on the Supreme Court to do anything representative of the will of the people, at least anytime soon. So that leads us to now the reason we're all here. And I was going to say the 28th Amendment, the We the People Amendment. Yeah, there we go. That it incorporates all of these and would eliminate the biggest impediments right now to people's rights, at least as it pertains to corporate oppression, state oppression. And to talk more about that and the other timelines, I'm going to pass it over to Katie without first saying that it is still very hard to amend the Constitution. But we are making incredible progress at Move to Amend. We are getting new co-sponsors by the day. We just added 2 more co-sponsors in the House to now have 69. Well on our way to our goal of 100. So I just wanted to have that little shout out, and again, thank you all for being here and for listening to me.
Hello. Okay, this is Katie. I'm a national co-director from Move to Amend. You guys get ready to read some cards. It makes it so much more interactive. And there's a script available with engaging questions that you can ask at this point, but for time's sake, I will skip those for today and just do a short introduction to the history of corporations in this country. Let's go back in time to right after the Revolutionary War, the birth of our democracy. If you wanted to incorporate in the first 75 years of our country, you had to go to the state legislator and have them write a law saying it could exist. You had to prove one thing. You had to prove that it served the public good. Now let that sink in. How many of these transnational corporations that have hijacked our democracy do you think would pass this step? People from the very beginning said corporations are fictitious entities that are allowed to exist for the greater good. Corporations existed for 3 to 50 years, but usually only lasted until the job was over. Compare that to what we have now. Today, you can pay as little as $100 and create a corporation. You can exist forever, and you are bound by law to generate a profit. A corporation's sole purpose is to limit liability and create a profit for its shareholders. One of the most important protections we have lost along the way happened in 1850. Up until then, it was a felony for corporations to contribute 1 penny to an election or a politician. People have lived through a revolution. They have fought a bloody war for freedom. They fought for the Bill of Rights. They saw so clearly how political and economic elite interests combined could quickly turn into oppression and tyranny. The Civil War was a turning point. Corporations became incredibly powerful, banking, railroad, and ammunition in particular. And as the dust settled from the turmoil of war, people started to notice the extent of this power. Abraham Lincoln writes to Colonel William F. Elkins, "I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. As a result of war, corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow. And the money power of our country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudice of the people until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. I feel at this moment more anxiety for the safety of my country than ever before, even in the midst of war." Pretty accurate. So this timeline shows how these corporations use the judicial branch of government to push their agenda. The rulings of 9 unelected officials granted corporations personhood. Through these absurd rulings, corporations have been able to use their inalienable rights meant for flesh and blood humans to seize our democracy and heavily skew the balance of power in their favor. So do we have any volunteers to read the first one?
Yeah, we have Tim. Go ahead, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
You're on mute, Tim.
Yeah.
Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, 1886. Without any formal argument, the court declares a corporation a person with the same rights as human beings. They grant them the 14th Amendment right to equal protection that was supposed to protect recently emancipated Black folks. Justices have since struck down hundreds of local, state, and federal laws enacted to protect people from corporate harm because these discriminate against corporations.
So
Does
we
that Black
see,
folks mean really Black males?
I'm not sure. Anyone have an answer to that?
Margaret Stack?
Go ahead, Margaret.
No, because the black males is the 15th Amendment, which refers to voting. And there was a big fight between the women suffragists and their allies, and anyway, it was the big fight at the time, and was unfortunately did not include, unfortunately, the word male was put into the amendment. But the 14th Amendment, Section 1, All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States, etc. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. So that would apply to both genders or any gender. And also that's how corporations wiggled in by saying that they were legal persons.
A
Well-
question? This is Bob Lord. I thought that the Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad was just what it says there, but there was a note scribbled by somebody in the side. I think it's called a margin note or something.
Called the head note.
Yes, yeah.
That much
This-
later was used as an excuse to do that the corporations had rights, but it wasn't in 1886.
Well, it's true that this amendment was never argued in court. It was a head note that a court reporter wrote, and it was never argued, and bam, that's how corporations became people under law.
Well, the story is the story is that the note said we're not going to that the justices had, one of the justices said, we're not going to discuss whether we think a corporation is a person for purposes of the 14th Amendment. We all agree that it is. But then in the actual case, it wasn't about that and it wasn't included. But there was a later case, I don't know, 10 years or so later, which did explicitly rule on corporate personhood. So
I think it was
bring
like
that
2
up all
years
the
later.
time. And it, you know, at this point, more than 100 years later, it's kind of not really very important. It's been well established since then by a number of court rulings.
Yeah, as soon as like 2 years later.
Do we want to go to the next slide? Who would like to read? I can do it. Hale versus Hinkle, 1906.
Katie, we have some.
Karen has her
Okay,
hand
awesome.
up.
Awesome, thanks.
Corporations get Fourth Amendment search and seizure protections. Corporations use this right to demand that regulators get warrants before they can inspect businesses for violations of labor and environmental laws.
So corporations are considered people now. They can use the Fourth Amendment to say, you can't come in here and you can't just check to see if you're dumping toxic sludge into the river or inspect how you're treating our workers. So, here, next slide.
Lawrence, you had your hand up next.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is Dodge versus Ford Motor Company from 1919. The Michigan Supreme Court rules that a corporation exists to maximize profits for its shareholders, regardless of the impacts on the planet, economy, health, and safety. This ruling mandates perpetual growth and practically guarantees human and evolution and environmental abuses.
Yeah, at this point, we have created a Frankenstein that serves the interests of a few at the expense of the majority. And it gets worse. So next slide.
We have 1, 2, 3 more slides. Do we have any takers with this one?
I see Karen, is your hand
Oh.
up again?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Corporations get Fifth Amendment protections against the government taking their property without compensation. They use this right to argue that any law that infringes on their profit is a takings, and they can sue to recoup all the profits they were making and would have made if the law hadn't passed. And this is a particularly nasty one When you look at the trade agreements and the investor state dispute system, where we can't say to corporations, you can't poison us, you can't do this. They can, if we put regulations on them that they don't like, then they can sue our government or wherever state for lost future profits. And so that's quite a nasty ripoff.
Yes, I agree. Next slide, please.
Margaret, I see your hand.
Okay, whoops.
We heard you.
Okay, Lewis K. Liggett Company versus Lee, 1933. The people of Florida passed a law that levied higher taxes on chain stores than local businesses. The Supreme Court overturned it because it discriminated against chain stores and therefore violated corporate 14th Amendment rights to equal protection.
Okay, let's go ahead and move to the next slide.
Yeah, it's the last. Oh,
I'll read it. Okay, Buckley versus Vallejo, 1976. The Supreme Court rules that corporations have First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. Since corporations do not have mouths to speak with, the court rules that they speak by spending money in elections and lobbying. This opened the door to a glut of corporate spending in the political process.
thank you.
Yes, well said, Margaret. It's the end of a democracy, in my opinion. Okay, next.
I can read this one if you want. First National Bank of Boston versus Belletti. Corporations use the First Amendment right to overturn state restrictions on corporate spending on political referenda. This precedent is used with Buckley versus Vallejo to throw out the attempts to remove the corporate money from politics.
Okay, and there's more.
There's plenty more. Like 4 more. 1, 2, 3, yeah, 4 more.
I can
Doesn't
read this one if we have,
Wonderful.
if we don't have any, or
Is it me?
Sure.
Pacific Gas and Electric Company versus Public Utilities Commission, 1986. Although PG&E has a monopoly on utilities in California, they refuse to allow an advocacy group to use extra space on their billing envelope to encourage energy conservation. The court sided with PG&E, upholding the corporation's right not to speak and protecting what they called the corporation's freedom of mind.
We
might want to mute that. Okay. Pacific Gas and Electric Company versus Public Utilities Commission, 1986.
She just read that one.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go to the next one.
Top 3. America is voting.
Okay. Do you want me to read this one? Or do we have someone?
Top 3.
International Dairy Foods Association versus Amstoy, 1996. Supreme Court overturns a Vermont law requiring the labeling of all products containing bovine growth hormone, citing the corporation's right not to speak and extend it to statements of fact as well as statements of opinion. So, wow. So the Supreme Court has ruled that corporations can poison us and they don't even have to tell you.
Okay.
Next, please. Who would like to
Hey.
read citizens versus?
Margaret, thank you. Go ahead.
So I have my hand up.
That's it. Thank you, Margaret.
Yeah, so I wanted to go back to the last one. So we're asking for comments as we go along, right?
Sure. Mhm.
Sure.
So
Good.
the dairy one, I think it's important to point out that the ruling says that the corporation has the right not to speak, and extending it to statements of fact as well as statements of opinion. So you could say that a flyer or something on the PG&E bill envelope encouraging people to conserve energy is an opinion, but stating that milk, it contains bovine growth hormone is a fact, or stating it that does not contain bovine growth hormone is a fact. So the court expanded the idea of corporations having ideas and having freedom of speech to say that they could not tell the truth if they didn't want to.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. Next card, please.
So Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission 2010, a mere 13 years ago. The Supreme Court reaffirms that a corporation is a person and states that any restrictions on corporate money in elections violates the corporation's First Amendment right to free speech. This ruling overturned most provisions of McCain-Feingold legislation that restricted corporate money in federal elections and reversed a 100-year precedent of congressional authority to regulate federal elections. It opened the floodgates to unlimited corporate spending in elections. $6 billion is spent in the 2012 election cycle.
And now we have 13 years of data, and the 2020 election cost $14.4 billion.
That is
So, anyone care to comment any further on that? So I think it's pretty obvious why we need to amend the Constitution to say a corporation is not a person and money is not free and not speech. We have a series of court cases propped up by a head note that has given corporations the First, Fourth, Fifth, and 15th Amendments rights that only human beings should have. We need to go over the Supreme Court's head and say that they were wrong on the law so people can reclaim their power over government. And now I'm going to hand it over to Jenny for more good news.
Yeah, state oppression timeline. Hello, my name is Jenny Spanos. I'm co-director for Move to Amend Coalition. Thank you for taking the time to come out here and learn this information. Many of you obviously are well versed with the law, Margaret, and she's on our law and research committee, so she is very in tune to that. And hopefully you're going to take this information to your communities and schools and educate them too. I'm with you, Melinda. I saw you in the chat. You know, I'm always moved by this powerful history and moved to anger and also to action. So what happens to people's rights when corporations have rights too? We're going to move on to these third sets here. And if we were in person, we'd be passing these out, right? It'd be really interactive. But I'm going to change it up a bit. Instead of calling on you if you raise your hand, go ahead and put your hand up if you don't want to be called on, because we're gonna move on, because we really want to get to your questions and your reflections, okay? And most of us do know this history of the first two timelines. We're fighting corporate rule by forming a people's movement to demand our rights. But there's one more timeline that we have to address, and we really need to understand how power and laws have worked together in this country. So this timeline's going to be about race. We could have also created a timeline that deals with class, with gender, with ability, etc. But we're using this one timeline to make a larger point about oppression in general. So while we work through this section, I want everybody to consider the impacts of our democracy as a result of legal creations of whiteness. We know it's a problem. And we've left people out of the we the people since the beginning. The courts gave corporations rights, and those harm everyone. But what about the relationship between the law, white privilege, corporate rule, and human rights in general? Because corporate rule harms us as groups disproportionately, and democracy has never been available to most people. Rights can be used for the good or bad purposes. In the cases of social movements, rights protect. In the case of white privilege and corporate rule, rights can harm, right? And at Move to Amend, we are building a people's movement to demand real democracy with human rights for all. And to do that, we have to work to pass this amendment. So let's move on to this first act. Let me see whose hands are not up. Al, would you like to read a card? Al? If you're on mute. If you don't want to read, put your hand up if you know how, and I won't call on you. I'll go down the list here. How about Bob? Oh, go ahead.
Who go ahead, Bob?
Who is this that's talking?
Well, this is Bob, but I thought somebody else started to talk and you said go ahead. So I'm not. Is it Bob doing it?
Yep, go please, Bob Lord.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Act 10, 1639. This Virginia colony statute grants the privilege of armament to all white men, yes, including indentured servants, but excludes black men.
Essentially legalizing or putting into law whiteness and blackness, putting race into our laws. Next slide. Janice, will you read the next slide? Or is that Janice? I don't want to talk. Sorry. I'm getting confused.
I think I was ready to.
I'm sorry, I want to, but I can't read. My eyes aren't working and it's too small and it's too dark and I have all these issues. But
I completely
please carry on.
understand. You were following my instructions correctly and I ruined it. I do apologize. How about Lawrence?
Thank you. So Negro women not exempted from tax. Act 7, 1668. Virginia colony law declares free English and free Negro women will be equally taxed, but Negro women will still be without rights. Unbelievable.
Absolutely unbelievable. So even if we were successful in winning an amendment, we won't live in a real democracy unless we work to dismantle the 300 years of laws that gave white people privilege and people over people of color, or even under a corporate system that harms everyone, right?
Mm-hmm.
We also can't fully fight corporate rule unless we know its consequences. But white privilege keeps white folks from having to know the worst effects of corporate rule. And that's why we have to take a lead in our organizing in our groups, led by class folks and people of color, as well as marginalized groups. We need to understand that we don't understand about how corporate rule affects immigration, prisons, healthcare, labor, and environment. And we need to know this from people who know it best, folks who are most impacted by that, right? Let's see who's next here. Let me call on someone else. And of course, if we're in person, everybody would have a card. So I hope this is working as far as an interactive program here. Melinda, would you care to read the next one?
Melinda here. Black people are banned from carrying weapons. Your little picture is over the letters on my screen. I'm on a phone. Carrying weapons of something, and if they presume to physically resist any, what is that word? They are punished with 30 lashes on his bare back. Oof. They are punished with 30 lashes on his bare back well laid on. Blacks could also be legally murdered if they are found lurking in obscure places, avoiding labor.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for that,
Okay,
Melinda.
this one is so this is the gut punch of the evening for me. So far, I was just getting furiouser and furiouser, but this one was the gut punch.
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. Let's see. Paula, would you like to read the next slide?
Slave and servant codes 1680 to 1705 established term slave as equivalent to Negro, while servant now refers only to non-Blacks or white persons. Slaves can be accidentally killed by their masters without penalty and are slaves for life along with all their children. In contrast, servants are granted new protections and privileges, including the right to take their master to court, the right to marry another European immigrant, and the guarantee of a severance paid in a plot of land when freed from service. Black-white marriage is banned and interracial sex is fined.
Thank you. Let's move on to more state oppression. Karen, can you read the next one?
You're muted.
Karen? You're muted, sorry.
We can come back to you.
Naturalization Act of 1790, immigrants are allowed to become citizens, but only if white. Without citizenship, non-whites cannot vote, own property, file lawsuits, or testify in court. This is quite an eye-opener, this edition, to see it and to know what's happening today.
Absolutely. You know, we at Move to Amend, we want to continue to work past, you know, to build on the good work of past struggles by collaborating with people within impacted communities. And we want to fight against forces that have been used in the past to divide us. And we can do that. We can win. We just need, it's not just in Washington, but in our everyday material lives. We need a movement because we want to create a world. You know, we can't deal with just one aspect of corporate power or one aspect of justice. They are interconnected, and we must build a movement that can do that. It's that larger movement, you know, in those larger movements, we are not alone. And the elites are watching. They're watching our progress, and they're afraid, you know, we will start to succeed. They will try to divide us in every way we can. We just need to be strong, united, committed in our demands for structural change. And if we do that, we will win. And you know, whenever we start to think, are we getting traction? It has been over 10 years now since Move to Amend formed, but this is a marathon, right? It's not a sprint. We're in it to win it. But we are hitting mainstream. We did go into the Barbie movie. Al, can you please mute? So let's move on to the next slide. Deb, can you read the next slide for us? You feel up to it?
Sure. The one that's on the screen right now, Bill of Rights.
Yes, ma'am. Please.
Bill of Rights, 1791. The first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution were adopted to protect we, the people, from excesses of government. At this time, we, the people, meant only white males who owned property and were over 21 years old. Only 5 to 8% of the people in the United States counted as people and got the protections of the Constitution.
Thank you for that. It was put in as an afterthought because it was demanded, right? Let me ask you this. Did people in power decide one day that African Americans should be emancipated from slavery, or that women should have the right to vote and not be considered property, and that people of all colors should be protected from discrimination wherever and whenever that happens? Is the law insular? The goal of Move to Amend is, not just to amend the Constitution. It's a way to talk about equality and to justice with millions of people across the country. So, we're going to keep pushing. Who wants to read the next one?
I can read that one. Marty.
Thank you, Marty.
Okay, so Indian Removal Act from 1830. Indigenous peoples are forced from their homelands east of the Mississippi River. Over 10 years, approximately 100,000 Native children and adults marched thousands of miles west into unknown desert territory. 15,000 people died along the way. I think that led to the Cherokee Trail of Tears. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That
Yes.
part of it.
You want to go ahead and continue?
Sure. I didn't realize you had that one coming up next. Okay, Cherokee Nation versus State of Georgia from 1831. A Cherokee delegation sues the state of Georgia for stripping their people of land and rights, but the court rules they are a domestic dependent nation, unable to claim status in court, validating Cherokee removal and state seizure of their land. Wow.
I know we should start with this so we can build ourselves back up with the people timeline, huh? Let me see who is ready to read People v. Hell.
I'll read that. This is June.
Thank you, June.
I'm very upset by what I'm hearing. I thought I understood this, but clearly I'm one of the sleeping people. The People versus Hall, 1854. Non-whites are barred from testifying in court. California Supreme Court reverses murder conviction of a white man, dismissing the testimony of a key Chinese witness stating that, quote, no Black or mulatto person or Indian shall be allowed to give evidence in favor of or against a white man.
State oppression.
Thank you,
I
Jen.
can continue if you'd like.
Yes, please. Here's another egregious case.
Yeah. Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. A slave sues his owner for freedom in a state where slavery is banned. The U.S. Supreme Court rules that Negroes are not U.S. citizens under any circumstances and have no rights which any white man is bound to respect. Free Blacks are taxed like whites, but receive none of the rights and protections of citizenship.
Oops.
Let's see here.
We skipped over one.
Yeah, I think we went one too far, Alfonso. Beth, do you want to read?
Sure. And then I want to raise a question after I read. Chinese Exclusion Act 1882 bans immigration of both skilled and unskilled Chinese laborers. This act is expanded in 1924 to restrict other Asian immigrants and ban Chinese-white marriages in California. And my question is, all these acts that we're reading from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, are these still on the books and followed as law in this country, or have they been overturned or new laws taken their place? Because this is really disgusting if we are following these laws.
Yes. So that's what movements have changed, right? We know that slavery is no longer illegal in this country. We have no longer are no longer putting people in camps, Chinese Americans in camps. But we still have, you know, fundamental and foundational systemic racism that's
But I mean,
you know, prevalent.
But I mean, these acts like this Chinese Exclusion Act as an example, is this still on the books? Is the government still following this as law?
Margaret's there. Go ahead, Margaret.
So, no, that act, I don't know if it's still on the books or if it's been formally overturned, but it's certainly not observed. And it's probably been overturned or superseded. And as far as intermarriage, there was actually a Supreme Court case, Loving versus Virginia, which outlawed racial marriage restrictions. So that was overturned in the whole United States by the Supreme Court, I think in the 1950s.
Yes, and that was part of the people's rights. So, you know, when you have the timeline, and we do have, I thought we had a picture of it in the thing, but when you have the whole timeline out and you have the different cards, you can see where we've won rights and where we have lost rights. Next slide. Let's move some of these through these pretty quickly. Yeah, thank you. We will you know, this is part of this is training. We do want, you know, that education too, but we want to inspire you to learn more and to share this in your communities. Okay, how about Dawes Land Allotment Act? Somebody ready to read that?
Okay, I'll go. The Dawes Land Allotment Act 1887 forbids communal land ownership by indigenous people and encourages native people to sell their land to whites, breaks up collectively owned native lands, and redistributes millions of acres as property to white squatters.
Jenny, one question I have is some of these, I believe, are federal laws. Some of them are state laws. Is there any way to distinguish, you know, what the jurisdiction of these laws is?
From each individual case?
Yes. Are these all Supreme Court or these from a lot of different places?
Federal.
Yeah, these are, the acts are federal, some are Supreme Court decisions, right? Some are, you know, corporate constitutional rights. Those are all judicial fiat. A lawmaker has never written a law saying, you know, a corporation is a person. Although actually now I guess Delaware technically giving corporations the right to vote. I'd have to dig into it more. If anybody else has anything they could add to that, I'm not sure.
Well, I'm reflecting back on the one from several slides ago about outlawing interracial marriage in California. So that wouldn't normally be a national law if it just applies to one state.
Right. Well, many states had those laws. It wasn't a federal law, right? But all the states, you know, the Loving case was out of, I want to say
Virginia.
West Virginia. That's it.
Virginia.
Thank you for that. And, you know, which after the Supreme Court made its decision, then it was the supreme law of the land.
Okay.
And the only way to override a Supreme Court decision, such as Citizens United or Southern Pacific Railroad versus the FEC, is to pass a constitutional amendment, which is why we are working to pass the We the People Amendment.
But this is a combination of state and federal.
Yes.
Okay.
Pat, next. Next slide, Alfonso. Okay, in honor of Labor Day, let's do this one for sure. Who's ready?
Jenny, I can do this one real quick.
Okay, thank you.
The Labor Relations Act of 1935, militant workers win the right to unionize, but white labor leaders compromise with Congress to exclude domestic and agricultural workers who are mostly Black, Chicano, and Chinese. Because most labor unions also exclude non-whites from membership, this effectively amounts to labor rights for white men only.
Social Security Act. Who would like to read this one?
I'll read this one. I actually benefit from it. Social Security Act 1935. This act provides old age insurance for the mostly white workforce of certain industries, excluding domestic and agricultural workers who are mostly non-white.
Japanese American internment, 1942. All Japanese Americans and Japanese residents living on the West Coast in the United States into unsanitary fenced concentration camps called the war relocation camps. Over 111,000 human beings are interned. 62% of them were American citizens. Next slide. Alfonso, next slide, please.
Yes. So that's the GI Bill. Do you want me to do that one or just keep that one?
Let's, for time's sake, let's move through a little bit quicker. Let's stop here. War on drugs. Here's a good one. Who wants to read War on Drugs?
Bloody mute.
I think this will be our last one. Lawrence.
President Richard Nixon declares a war on drugs, which disproportionately and violently targets economically impoverished communities of color for the next 40 years, leading to mass incarceration for drug-related offenses. White populations are relatively unaffected.
Thank you for that. 3 strikes laws, 26 states passed mandatory minimum sentences of laws that require jail time for first, second offenses and life in prison for crimes as petty as stealing a pair of gym socks, shoplifting a pair of baby shoes, and stealing a slice of pizza. There's still somebody sitting in New Orleans, in a Louisiana jail, prison on life for just such a crime. In California, Blacks make up only 7% of the population, but 45% of those convicted are on a third strike. The NYPD stop and frisk. Go to the next slide, please, Alfonso. Post 9/11 disappearances. Let's go ahead and have somebody read this one. This is all within our lifetimes, right?
I can do it.
Please do.
Immediately following the attacks in New York City, thousands of Arab, Muslim, and Southern Asian men living in the U.S. cities are snatched from their homes, places of work, and off sidewalks by federal agents without warrants or charges, shackled hand and foot, detained, and prevented by the Federal Bureau of Prisons from contacting family, press, and attorneys. Many were held for months in abusive conditions. Not one of these thousands has ever been publicly charged with terrorism.
Next slide, please. Patriot Act 2001, passed by Congress following September 11. The act violates civil liberties and privacy of all individuals. Originally scheduled to expire, key provisions were renewed in 2011. Next slide. Give everybody just a chance to look at that. Next slide. Arizona 2010, police are required to ask individuals to present their citizenship or immigration documents if they have unidentified reasonable suspicion that that person stopped may be in Arizona illegally, justifying racial profiling, harassment, and the expelling of American citizens back to Mexico because they didn't have their papers. Next.
Can I ask a question here?
Yes, please.
So this Arizona Senate bill, was this ever, what do you call it? Challenged by
Reversed?
the DOJ because of racial profiling and harassment? to overturn it?
I'm not sure. I would have to look into it.
I don't think so.
Yeah, it's not that I know, but I'm not sure.
So it's still on the books.
It's my
I think so.
understanding. In Alabama, there's a bill 56 from 2011 that targets, in addition to police, school administrators at the high school, middle school, and elementary school levels are required to demand citizenship or immigration documents for any child who they reasonably suspect is living in Alabama illegally. Children are racially singled out in their classrooms in front of their peers and handed papers from their teachers demanding to see immigration and citizenship documents. Next slide. NYPD stop and frisk 2011. Over 600,000 public police stops were made on the street, 84% of those stops being Black or Latino. So why do we need to build a multiracial movement across class and gender lines for justice?
Yes, that's it.
Because none of us are immune, right? Many of us have been disproportionately harmed and wounded by the system for hundreds of years. For me, the question is, what is going to be done? There's never a time in this country's history that was kind of democratic, right? For the majority of people, there was no age of original innocence to go back to. There's always been struggle between people, money, and power, and people who wore the harms of that money and power on their bodies and in their lives, and who formed movements to say that they had dignity and that the state must recognize that. And so for us, the question is the same. What's it going to be? Money distress or control over our lives in the form of continued control over our lives in form of corporations that have taken over our government? We wear those wounds on our bodies, and people of color and communities of poor communities and women and disenfranchised people wear those wounds more and disproportionately. If we're going to win the amendment, we have to win for all of these people. If we are going to win justice, we have to listen to all of these people and to listen to each other, tell our stories of how corporations, money, and power have harmed us over time. And that's really an important part of this exercise and this timeline. We have to build a movement that is so powerful, so filled with those stories that we can't be stopped. That's why I am personally part of Move to Amend, because the constitutional amendment is part of a broader question about what it would look like for the 95% of the people who didn't count the first time to have a real and actual say in something that's an actual democracy. One of the most important cards on that timeline for me is that slave and servant code card, right? Where they created a term for white people and a term for servants for white people and slaves for Black people. They did that to divide us so that we would spend our time fighting the people that had a little less, so that we'd never look at the top of the pyramid and see who was actually controlling it all. It's time for us to come together and look at the top of that pyramid. Name the problem, name that it is unjust, and do something about it. So I hope that you start feeling your power, and get serious about that power and what that means to believe, and from what form that power can collectively, how we can come together collectively to eliminate and undo some of the most grotesque injustices. And remembering that, the women's suffrage movement went into a male exclusive Congress saying that they were people, they were human beings, and they had to be recognized by law. And they fought and they fought and they fought. And here I am, right? Today, as a beneficiary of that fact, of that fight, I am that fact, right? And we know that we can live in a world that is completely dominated by corporations and corporate interests. And we're going to DC next month and to the Supreme Court and Congress. And we are saying we demand an amendment. And we're not asking, we're demanding. We're demanding justice, and we're going to do it together. So, please continue to support this movement. Please add your experience and your stories and your power and your voice to the movement. And I thank you so much. I really and truly am honored to be on this journey with you. And I think we're moving into some question and answer periods. We want to get your thoughts and your opinions and your reflections on what you've heard so far. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Alfonso.
Thank you, Janie. This is the time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions about anything that you heard tonight, now's the time to either put stack on the chat or raise your hand. I see that Karen raised your hand. Go ahead. Go ahead, Karen. Do you wanted to ask a question?
Yes, I was really impressed with the expanded program. I had been through everything, but then when we start looking at the states, which we know that they're targeting states now more than ever, and a lot of the bills and everything come out of one organization. And so it's good to really see that piece of it. And I hope that I can get someone else also to partner with me here in Portland in spreading the word. Or I'm outside of Portland, but yeah. Great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you for everything you do. I see that there's some other folks like Margaret, Bob, and June that have their Zoom hands up. Do you guys have a question, or is this still from the previous segment? Bob? Or June, do you have a question?
Well, I was waiting for Bob to unmute.
Guys, I got muted. Sorry.
Oh, sorry about that.
That was not my fault. Okay. The PG&E one. In California, there are many utilities. California does not have a single monopoly utility, which was, I thought, kind of implied in that charge. But all of the 100 or more utilities have a monopoly in their district. San Francisco is a district and has its own utility. Sacramento has a district and its own. Modesto has Modesto Utilities. And PG&E covers a lot of the area, and the area they cover is what they have a monopoly on, not the state. Even though the thing was what the legal goings on that was shown was in the state of California. It did not apply to other than, I think, PG&E.
Does somebody want?
Yeah.
Yep. Go ahead.
I'll point out a couple of things. Back in the chat, I posted a book called A Brutal Reckoning by Peter Cozzens, and the subtitle is Andrew Jackson, the Creek Indians, and the Epic War for the American South. And it's pretty much all that those two slides talked about, and the Indian removal and the Cherokee the Trail of Tears and all like that. And the other thing I also put in the chat, I believe, was looking back. Currently, we're fighting to get Washington, D.C. as the 51st state. So Washington, D.C. has a lot of American citizens that don't have all the same rights as other American citizens. And I see this as a critical point for getting moved to amend and rescinding the corporate personhood. It can happen a lot faster if we can get DC on board as a state. I'd also like to split California up, but
I wouldn't mind splitting California, but I am adamantly opposed to a little city being a state. Bernie Sanders gave a talk in San Francisco some years back in San Francisco and opened up with the comment, "It is so good to be back in San Francisco, a city with more people than my entire state." And California has 40 million people in it and only 2 senators. And you want to give a little city 2 senators?
they have the population. They have more
No, they do not have the population. California's got 40 million people. That's 20 million people per senator.
All right, I just wanted to, if I might, try to get
I
us
want to
back
give June an
on track.
opportunity to ask her questions. Sorry.
Yeah.
I could see that if we were sitting around, we'd have quite an interesting conversation here. So watching your slides go by and the timeline, it seems like this thing we call a democracy is kind of deeply flawed at its root. So there's a case that seems to be being made that this whole thing should be overhauled. Or are you at Move to Amend talking about incremental change?
Thank you for that question.
Who wants to take that one? Greg, you want to?
Well, we're talking about systemic change beginning with the We the People Amendment, but as our goals originally stated, we're looking for constitutional renewal that goes beyond that in a variety of ways. But to do that requires things like building a movement and to acknowledge the oppression historic that has gone on from day one, and understanding that to change that, we're going to need all the allies we can get, both at a national level and local level. So we've got to go horizontal and vertical and acknowledge how these 3 timelines, these 3 sort of histories are all interconnected. And that, again, we the people of the preamble of the Constitution has always been sort of a myth and a lore, and has got to fundamentally change. And, we're only a part of it. We're focusing on the amendment. There are other people out there that are focusing on other sort of fundamental human rights, and it should be said, rights of nature that are an important piece of this as well. So there's a lot of fundamental change that is required.
Yeah, we have some folks coming to talk with us about the green amendments that are being worked on around the country, state by state. But again, these are kind of incremental changes. The green amendments really don't have much, won't have much teeth if corporations are protecting their rights, because they're directly opposed in many ways. So this is a deeply systemic question.
It is. And before there are other questions asked and some other things, I know Katie wanted to make an announcement in a pitch. Katie?
Yes. Well, I'm really love this presentation. Jenny and I and Alfonso are going to be doing it in New York next month. So this was a great practice and run through. And every time I see it, which is about the 5th time now, I'm very deeply moved by it. And I hope that you found this program educational and you see the need to expand this program as well. So as the new fundraising director, I'm here to ask you today to please donate to movetoamend.org. We can't do any of this work without you, and we have lots of work to do. So again, that's movetoamend.org/donate. And we thank you for coming tonight. And I'm always inspired every time I meet with with all the affiliates and volunteers. You guys are wonderful.
A quick question. Who was I speaking to about the DC statehood? Tim? I've got a lot of thoughts about that. I really would like to talk to you about that. The representation in the Senate does need to be dealt with.
Maybe you two can exchange. Maybe you two can exchange emails on the chat and continue that.
Yeah.
Because we're sort of almost over time. We're actually past time, and maybe we just wanted to devote what remaining time we have to answer any questions you may have about how to take this back to where you are and explore trying to approach either your academic institutions, high school, college, whatever, or any group you're a part of, your affiliate, any other sort of, doesn't even have to be a formal group. You could do this with a bunch of friends of yours, whether it's in person or virtual. So we're happy to sort of answer any questions or comments or queries you have in that vein, focusing on that dimension as we wrap up.
And while you're getting to acknowledge, this is a system.
Oh, you're breaking up.
Breaking up.
Change solution. This definitely gets to the root of lots of injustices, and I just wanted to point that out. Do you have a hand about what Greg just asked, or are you still just up? Okay. Anyone else would like to comment on what Greg just said?
Karen, that you raising your
Yeah, I
hand?
see Karen, Bob, and Tim. Your hand was up again, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go in that order.
Mine never went down. I'm sorry.
Gotcha.
No worries.
Karen, and then Tim.
I am thinking of, so many of the presentations in our area, and certainly actually even before Move to Amend, the corporate personhood working group that was at the First Unitarian Church downtown Portland. I am thinking, wow, this would be really good as a community event. And certainly it impacts everybody. So there is nothing really political about it. It's an education piece. So I will be talking with people that have the ability to maybe make that happen.
Great. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Okay. Well, I'll go next. Let's see. I was just noticing on my calendar, it says the 17th of September is Citizenship Day. And this presentation was referring to as Constitution Day. And I think they're both the same thing, but that would be a great day to have a program in your community. And also I was going to ask Greg about two versions of this presentation. The short version that we could present in our groups as sort of an exercise, and then the longer version we could present to our community as a citizenship training program.
Well, the short version, because I've done a short version trying to do it in a school setting, which trying to compact all of this in 45 minutes, which would be sort of a normal high school class, is a challenge. And basically all you can do is have each set of cards, pass them out to, students, and have each of them read it. And you have to boil down. You can't do all of them. You don't have time to do it. But I think just the mere reading of them and having a very quick, like 2-minute intro and 2-minute follow-up, and then give them the website to where they can get more information. Again, it's a taste, it's a process. It's helping people sort of be exposed in some cases for the first time. So for a shortened version, particularly if you're trying to get it in a classroom setting, just doing the cards alone without elaborating on any of them, because you don't have time. The cards speak for themselves. They blow people away, as people have said in the comments when they've heard some of these things. You don't even need to animate some of these in many cases. So that's a shortened version.
Okay, I see Marty and then Paula.
Yeah, one element that was missing from the presentation to see, I really appreciated your gathering all that information, is how do you go about actually amending the Constitution? What is the process? I think having that information would be very helpful too. I mean, I know that a certain number of states either have to pass it at their legislature or they have to have a public vote about it. And then once a certain number of states approve it, then it gets approved at the federal level. It's a rather complicated process, and there are a couple different options. So identifying how that process works, I think, would be helpful for people who are not that well informed about it.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we'll go ahead. I think that's a good idea, and we'll add that to the page so that people have that handy. Paula?
Yeah, one possible short version that might whet folks' appetite is to, with the card, especially around the one about who the first 10 amendments actually applied to, being 5 out of 8, especially in light of this push to go back to the good old days, is to have that card and have another card that shows where the main text, the only rights in the main text, property and freedom of contract and the Great Compromise, when it's politically correct to say it, you know, when Texas said we could say that out loud, was the one that said slaves were only 3/5 human. And of course, the native indigenous people were not citizens at all. They were going to be independent nations we would deal with treaties. But a couple of those just to whet the appetite. Do you really want to go back to the original, what the framers wanted? Because here's what the framers wanted in the main text, okay? Even the first amendments had to wait to the main text, hence the Great Compromise, all right, and stuff. So that might whet the appetite to get people to then go more in-depth into the cards themselves in more detail.
I just put in the chat, it's somewhat old, but still, sadly, still relevant, this Legalized Democracy video of Mutumin that we put together that has all 3 of the timelines, but not all of them. But it's designed to be shown in a classroom, 28 minutes.
Katie?
Yeah, I've volunteered to show this I have 2 high schoolers, and we have decided to do it over 2 days because it's just so powerful, and I hate to leave things out because just talking to it with the kids, they're just, what? So shocked, and it was really hard to narrow it down. So we've decided to take a 2-day session and really delve into it.
That sounds wonderful. That sounds wonderful. Sorry, my volume's a little weird. June, I see your hand.
Yeah, I think another point that you might be able to make is that this kind of rises above or beyond, or I don't know what the word is, beneath, whatever, politics. That it really has not very much to do with the political parties as they currently exist today or in the past. There are other issues at play here. I think that I was sort of surprised at some of the decisions that were made under supposedly liberal administrations.
Absolutely. This problem is not a left or right problem. It's,
right.
You know.
And of course, the Democrats, Republicans, and what have you have changed over the decades as well. So.
Yeah, unlimited giving in our elections and corporations being able to claim rights, inalienable rights meant for human beings. Yeah, it's made a mockery of anything we want to call a democracy, really. But we still have the power, and we have to exercise that.
Right, and it's just a comment about how partisan and how partisan much of the discussion has become. in recent years, and that this really is separate from those partisan politics.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. If that's good on the questions, please feel free to reach out to us anytime. If you're trying to arrange this in your communities or your school and want some more clarification or have any questions at all, please reach out to Greg at movetoamend.org. And he can help you, or reach out to info@movetoamend.org, and we will get those questions answered for you and help you get all the support you need to make this a successful event in your community. Thank you so much, JD, for all you do. We couldn't be doing this without you. Thank you all, and happy Constitution Day.
And thank you also, because like I said, Jenny and I and Alfonso will be doing this in New York. So we're going to take in all of your suggestions and really tweak this to make it even better.